2:00 a.m. in a dense, soupy fog on the St. Lawrence River, and a ship is dying. The Empress of Ireland, pride of the Canadian Pacific Railway line, has encountered another ship in the murky dark. The collier Storstad has plunged its reinforced bow deep inside the Empress's hull with the deadly efficiency of an assassin's stiletto. The blow had struck between two critical compartments, the boiler rooms, which flooded so rapidly that many passengers asleep nearby were caught out in their cabins by a wall of white water. There was no hope for escape, and now there plays out a desperate struggle for survival as the ship's starboard side dips closer and closer to the river's surface. It's painfully clear that the end is coming. At the lifeboats, officers and crew fight desperately to get the davits swung out and the boats away, but water creeps closer and closer. Then, with a flash, the lights across the liner die out, plunging it and the nearly 1,500 people aboard into near-perfect darkness. There are only minutes left, and the Empress of Ireland is about to take its final plunge. The Empress lists and sags heavily in the water. The gash ripped in her side is letting in around 250 tons of the St. Lawrence's chilly water every second. It leaves the ship's crew with very little time and opportunity to save their passengers, let alone their ship, but they spring into action regardless. Chief Officer Mansfield Steed is a strange sight. He's stood, clad in his pajamas, desperately directing the unlashing and swinging out of lifeboats on the liner's starboard side. The boat deck has become clogged with passengers lucky enough to have made it topside, mostly first and second class. Steerage has not been so lucky. Down there is the very picture of hell. With the ship's lights extinguished when the dynamos had been inundated with water, people who'd been asleep only moments before could just grope for rescue in the darkness or fumble with matches. The inside of their ship has become a blackened out maze of winding hallways and staircases that become steeper and more treacherous as the list grows worse. There had been 3 night duty stewards in third class whose job it had been to oversee the steerage quarters over the long, boring hours at night. They had suddenly been confronted in the middle of their shift with a torrent of water. Maybe they rushed to crank shut the watertight doors at their stations as they'd been trained to do, or they might have tried to light the emergency oil lamps. We'll never know, because not a single one of them survived. On the decks above, night watchmen and the other classes, like Leonard Powell, rushed to and fro as the decks beneath them began to slump, lighting emergency lamps, around 8 in total it's thought, so the passengers who were lucky enough to be berthed higher up in the hull made it out in the nick of time. In just a few minutes, the many staircases throughout the ship will become unusable. It will be impossible to walk without standing on what had once been the bulkheads or the walls. On the boat deck, Steed and his men bodily haul the big steel ship's boats out of their chocks and over the side of the superstructure, which usually towered high but now was beginning to nearly kiss the St. Lawrence, a sure portent of imminent doom. From the bridge, Captain Kendall bellows orders through his speaking trumpet, frustratingly ineffectual over the din of the panicked passengers, the grunts of the struggling crew at the lifeboats, and the groaning of his own ship underfoot. Kendall had been the star of the Canadian Pacific Line, an overnight celebrity when he had stopped a murderer from fleeing for safety aboard his ship. Now he watched on as his newest command, one of the finest in the company, was dying in front of him. He had telegraphed down to run the engines ahead to try to beach her, but there was no steam pressure left. The little arrows on the telegraphs pointed pathetically at full ahead, but the engine's crankshafts lay silent and immobile. Those telegraph arrows would still be pointing to full ahead over 110 years later. So the Empress wasn't moving, but it must have shocked even Kendall how quickly she was going down. The ship had been built with all the modern safety features: watertight bulkheads dividing her into compartments, a double bottom to protect against grounding, thick steel doors to shut and check the flow of water throughout the ship. But the Empress's compartments were big, too big, and the margin of buoyancy slim. The watertight doors were well and good in theory, but they relied on a system where they had to be closed by hand. In the event, her crew simply had no chance. Anybody that tried, deep in the heart of the liner, was overcome and drowned. Kendall gripped his ship with one hand and the speaking trumpet with the other as the Empress rolled around him. Among the throng of frightened passengers stood John Delamont, his wife Seraphine, and their 3 children. The husband and wife were a pair of Salvation Army members on board, about 170 in total, who were on their way to a great congress in London. John and his 2 sons had been birthed far away from Seraphine and Elizabeth. When the impact had occurred, John and the boys had been rattled awake, then dressed quickly, lifebelts on, and rushed aft to find the others. They found the cabin locked or the door jammed. Either way, it didn't matter to John. He threw his weight at it and broke it open by force. The group had hurried topside and made it out just in time to join the crowd that stood waiting nervously for the boats to be got away. But feeling the deck surge to starboard underfoot, they struggled to the port side to wait there instead. The sight that met them was pitiful. Crews struggled to push the boats out and over the side of the ship that was now raised so high in the air, the boats could only swing back inwards. It was like a Sisyphean struggle. Any boat that was lowered on that side anyway would be flipped or dashed to pieces on the ship's bulging rivet heads as it scraped its way along the hull. None of them could be launched. On the other side, there was more success. Chief Officer Steed knew his work well. Somehow, his ragtag group of crewmen, many still in their nightclothes like he was, had managed to fumble about in the dark with enough skill to get some of the boats swung out and ready to load. Women and children first, be damned. This was a struggle for survival. There was just no time. Men, women, and children desperately crowded in, but the readying and lowering of boats was not Chief Officer Steed's only contribution that night. When the impact had been felt, and Steed had been woken with a start from his bunk, he'd instinctively rushed aft to Ronald Ferguson, the Chief Marconi telegraph operator. Ferguson had been in his bunk too when he felt the jolt. He himself rushed to his set and alerted any nearby stations that something was wrong. "Stand by for a distress call," he had said. "We've struck something." But being a wireless operator, it was not his call to send an SOS. He'd need to find an officer for approval or wait for orders. But fortunately, one was at hand. Steed had practically burst through the door to give the order without even having spoken with the captain yet. Thanks to those men, the Empress gave out a short distress call before her voice died altogether when the steam ran out. But help was on the way. Steed and others, including First Officer Edward Jones and Second Officer Roger Williams, worked to fill the lifeboats. Lifeboat 1 had been just 4 feet above the water when it drifted clear of the ship. Lifeboat 3 gets away too, even after a handful of men have jumped in at the last possible second. Boat 13 is less fortunate. In the haste of the unfolding disaster, it's got stuck against a davit and broken free with a violent lurch that spills passengers out into the water below. It recovers and starts down again, only to be nearly toppled once more by people jumping in from above. At the stern, hundreds of feet away, people grapple with the hooks, blocks, and falls for boat 16 on the port side and 15 on the starboard. But like the others on that side, boat 16 is left in place. It's just too late to get it out and over, but 15 is now sagging closer and closer to the water. The davits are swung out. A crowd surges into the boat and it jerks down towards the river, but then it too fouls somehow and turns over with a lunge that spills its occupants out into the water. It lands on top of them, upside down, with no hope of righting. Down below deck, water roars in faster and faster as more of the great hole on the ship's side is pulled under. Any open portholes only add to the speed that she sinks. Soon, the promenade decks have water spilling over their scuppers and bulwarks and running the length of them. Time is quickly running out, and the Empress is leaning over at something like 30 degrees. Inside the ship, the once grand interiors have become an impassable obstacle course. The grand staircase in first class, with its landings, is now a hopeless affair because the slippery tiled floors and sharply angled stairs are nearly impossible to climb. The walls on the left-hand side of the ship are quickly becoming something more like a ceiling. Doors to the outside world now hang ominously above people's heads as they struggle to climb up. Outside, in the cold, foggy air, Lifeboat 5 somehow clears the ship. It doesn't even need to be lowered down. The boat hooks detach and it just floats away cleanly because the water has already reached the boat deck itself. Captain Kendall must have watched with agonizing, frozen fascination as his ship slowly succumbed and the angle grew worse and worse. Miraculously, the crew also managed to get Lifeboat 11 away, loaded heavily with around 40 people. It floats slowly off, but the ship's towering funnels loom terrifyingly overhead. From deep within the ship trudges a motley assortment of firemen and engineers who have climbed the emergency escape ladders and emerge at the base of the ship's after funnel, abandoning their posts for a shot at survival. But with the boiler and engine rooms now deeply underwater, they surely can't be blamed for that at all. The Empress has reached an impossible angle, nearing 40 degrees or more. Those working at the boats now cannot do so without holding on with one hand at least. And then suddenly, the end comes. Its starting pistol is a deep, resounding boom, the death throes of a giant, a steam explosion somewhere deep within that shudders the dying ship's structure and resonates like rolling thunder. With that, the list begins to get suddenly greater, and the Empress begins to roll. On the boat deck, First Officer Edward Jones has been fighting to get Boat 7 filled and away. But behind him, funnel number 2 begins to drop down straight for him. He and his men have run out of time. They're swept away by a surging wave as it crashes up the boat deck. Jones plunges into the cold water, and Boat 7 goes down. The engineers, who have really only just emerged from within, urgently grip onto the base of the king posts, the tall masts used for loading cargo. The Empress's port side now lifts high into the air, but all the equipment stored up there begins to rain down with deadly effect. Lifeboats and rafts, oars, spars, blocks, tackle, winches, and people. It all comes crashing down with a thunderous roar that drowns out the cries of stunned humanity below. As the Empress comes hurtling down into the water, onto her side, her two massive funnels slap the river surface with a terrific impact that shoots coal dust and sparks out, but not before one clips Lifeboat 11 with its nearly 24 occupants. The boat is crushed like it had been struck by some giant's fist. Boat 1 narrowly misses being crushed by the forward funnel 2, only to be suddenly hit by the Marconi wireless antennas strung between the masts. The occupants struggle quickly to untangle their boat before it's dragged under, and they get away. Dozens and dozens of people find themselves suddenly treading water, with the hulk of the Empress of Ireland looming directly overhead. Pieces still come off and rain down. The enormous cargo derricks break free, and one smashes down into the water right on top of Chief Officer Steed, and he's killed instantly. All around, there are surreal sights. Some of the engineers manage to climb the king posts like monkeys, and now the posts are horizontal and the men can crawl along them. One of them is the chief engineer, Sampson. He and his men had tried to save the ship, rushing to shut watertight doors and get steam into the engines, but it had been a hopeless task. As Sampson tries to make his way along the precarious king post, a clatter sounds from above, and he's clipped by falling debris, plunging into the water below. Elsewhere, Captain Kendall re-emerges cold, wet, and a little worse for wear. As the ship rolled, he was thrown bodily into a telegraph and over the side. Stunned for a moment, he gathers himself, looks around for a lifeboat to re-establish command. As the Empress settles onto her starboard side, there is a whoosh as the great mouths of the funnels meet the river's surface. They lead into uptakes, which funnel smoke, fumes and gases from the boilers, stories below in the ship's bowels. But now, water begins to surge in like a raging whirlpool, taking debris and people with it. An officer, maybe Second Officer Williams, fights the current in vain. He screams, but he's taken down into the black maw of a funnel top. High on the port side, now lifted stories into the air, men and women cling on for dear life to the railing they'd been gripping when the ship had started to go. But one by one, their strength gives out. They drop to bounce sickeningly off the vents and structures on the far side of the ship before splashing down into the river. From above roar down the portside lifeboats, which were never launched. Their lines crack as they break, and the boats, each a few tons in weight, thunder down onto the heads of people below. It's a scene of indescribable chaos and suffering. Probably the most strange sight of all can be seen on the Empress's overturned hull, because a handful of people were quick enough to scramble with the ship as it rolled, so they've ended up safely on its side. Among them is the Delamont family, John, Seraphine and their children. Leonard, one of the boys, takes off his cork life jacket and gives it to his mother instead. John Delamont is confronted with a sudden, terrifying reality. He can't swim. But the Empress stays there, seemingly suspended, sitting pathetically on her side. Some even think, optimistically, that she might be grounded on the river bottom and can't sink, but it's a forlorn hope. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the black river water begins to creep up the hull, and each wave laps slightly higher than the last. The portholes hiss as air is forced out in huge volumes by the inrush of water, and the Empress is going down. The water around the sinking Empress is filled with people who flail wildly, unable, like John Delamont, to swim. Some have suffered blows to the head and are dazed or concussed. So much debris rained down when the ship rolled that many victims are dead because of blunt force trauma. Others have survived only with broken bones. But surviving the sinking ship is one thing. Now, those unfortunates are faced with making it through the bitter, numbing cold. It's late May, spring, but the river water is 2.2 degrees Celsius or 36 Fahrenheit. It saps the energy from competent swimmers as well as it does from those that aimlessly struggle just to tread water. Like Titanic's victims 2 years before, they begin to go numb and lose consciousness as the cold chokes the life from them. The lucky ones find their way to boats or floating debris. First-class passenger George Smart had floated for agonizing minutes, clinging to debris, before being pulled aboard a half-submerged collapsible boat that had floated off the wreck by itself. He was so stunned by the awful cold, he couldn't take it all in. Another passenger, Lionel Kent, had struck out swimming for what he thought was a small island, but was actually a heavily laden boat. Someone reached for his hand, but he was so drained by the cold he couldn't even lift it up to reach. They hauled him out of the water regardless and set about reviving him. Some of the first-class passengers, awakened not by the impact of the collision, but the braying of the ship's whistles, dressed completely before heading out. One is Tyria Townsend, who completed her ensemble with a heavy overcoat and laced-up boots. She was nearly drowned because of it, but saved by a man, Clayton Burt, who just earlier that night had been her dinner table companion in the saloon. Others pull off a minor miracle. They swim for the ship that had hit their own. The Storstad had emerged from the fog and struck the Empress plumb on her starboard side. It had then drifted off into the murk and was obscured by the fog. But incredibly, as soon as the Empress went over and sank, the cloud of fog was blown away. Maybe by the rush of air from deep within the Empress as she sank, so the Storstad's reassuring lights came clearly into view. A number of swimmers strike out for the big ship and its promise of rescue, led by an anonymous passenger who called out encouragement and drove them forward. Not many made it, but those who did owed it to the man who had cheered them on. Nobody knew who he was, because he never made it himself. They came aboard the Storstad dripping wet and miserable, arms and legs numbed by the cold to the point of uselessness. For their part, the crew of the Storstad had got their boats into the water and rushed out to do all that they could. Miraculously, one of those pulled from the water is Chief Engineer Samson. He's survived the impact of debris and his fall into the water, and he's hurried aboard the Storstad into that ship's chief engineer's cabin. Back on the overturned hull of the Empress, passengers mill about. The entire scene is bathed in an eerie, ethereal blue glow, thanks to life preservers coated in a chemical mixture designed to burn on contact with the water. The end is clearly coming now. It's obvious the water is rising higher and higher up the hull. The choice is simply to stay and wait or to jump in now and get on with it. Many choose the latter. One is young Leonard Delamont. He turns to his mother, who is just given his life jacket to, and kisses her on the cheek. With that, he leaps from the side of the ship, leaving his family behind, but he's never seen again. Around the Delamonts, a strange, disturbing scene is playing out. Either people had slept through the disaster until it was too late, thrown from their bunks by the rolling of the ship, or some had just groped through the darkened hull only to find themselves in port-side cabins and public rooms. Either way, the end result is the same. From open portholes, there come waving hands. The frames of the portholes are just far too small for most average-sized people to squeeze through. Dr. James Grant is the ship's surgeon. He had slept through the entire ordeal before being thrown out of bed when the Empress had rolled. To his horror, the corridors and entrances that led outside on deck were lifted high above his head, and he had to crawl on hand and knee, digging his fingernails into the carpet. He hauled himself up, gripping anything he could, beams, panels, doorknobs, until he reached a porthole that had once been on the ship's port side and was now essentially on the ceiling. He lifted his head through and called for help. Some of those standing on the hull rushed to his aid, and they actually managed to pull him through with a heave. But others aren't so lucky. They wave in vain, tragically in vain, because the water surges slowly along the hull and drags them under. In the weeks to come, recovery divers will find them still stuck halfway out the brass portholes. People on the overturned hull of the Empress simply begin to step off and into the river. There's no need to dive in now because the ship is slowly vanishing under and the water is rising gradually up like the tide at a beach. The scene of strange, orderly calm changes suddenly when there is a loud boom and the ship's hull ruptures near the engine room. Unable to exhaust out the ship's funnels, which are now underwater, whatever steam was still in the lines has built up enough pressure to detonate outwards with a loud roar. It creates a blast that escapes through the shell plating and throws bystanders up to 50 feet away from the sinking ship. Smoke and steam rushes out into the night, creating a kind of mushroom cloud, and the ship begins to drop faster. On the small section of hull still above the water, the Delamonts are frozen in fear, but the water surges around their feet, and they've run out of time. They're dragged under. The Empress finally disappears beneath the surface, but she's not yet filled completely with water. Pockets inside the hull are still filling, and water roars in with all the force of a great waterfall. It creates a vortex on the surface that sucks people down with her, the Delamonts included. Seconds must have felt like hours in that blind panic, but then the current is reversed. A massive volume of water, about 20,000 tons of it, was displaced by the Empress's hull. It surges in behind and then rockets back up towards the surface, blasting dozens of people who were drawn in behind the ship back up, mercifully, for air, creating a series of tidal waves that washes boats and people away into the night in the process. John Delamont sputters water out and gasps for air at the surface. He's surrounded by hundreds of people, alive, dead, something in between. The cold is stunning, and Delamont can't swim. But by some miracle, he reaches a piece of debris and holds on for dear life. In the darkness, as he calls for help, his wife and daughter hear his voice and they recognize it. They all find each other and cling on for life. Elizabeth's hair has been torn from her head by another struggling survivor who had clawed at her for buoyancy, but she is alive, and so too are her mother, father, and one of her brothers. They make it through the night, treading water for over an hour, a miracle in itself, given the frigid temperatures of the water, but as they clung together, waiting for rescue, directly beneath them, the Empress of Ireland, dropped into her grave.